Hello and welcome back to Parley, usually my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit, but this is Crew Parley, where I've submitted the prompt and I'm going to respond to your responses. So the prompt I did for this was a bit delayed. We had a huge backup for a while, so this one is from January 2026, about the economy of immersion. It's not a great name for the thing I'm talking about. Let me read you the prompt. Can you think of any experiences you found especially immersive, in games or otherwise? How did they work their techniques upon you? Any favorite techniques in general that cause immersion? An example would be games that put UI elements into the world, like guns which have an ammo count on their actual in-game model instead of you seeing it on your UI. Though you may not agree that such a technique is immersive. And that leads me to the topic I want to push on here. I want you to try to think of times where you felt immersion may have been prioritized at the cost of some other element, like clarity, or where a game reached for a lot of immersion but it didn't work well for you. Show me the dark side of immersion. Looking forward to your responses. So you get what I mean. The trade-offs of immersion is sort of a better way to describe what I'm talking about here. And I'm not trying to bury the lead that I think immersion is very overrated. I use that term intentionally. Overrated, not worthless, not how people usually say overrated and they're implying they think that it's just stupid or something. Overrated. Good, but not as valuable as it is treated as being. And I think this because there are consequences to immersion. So I'm going to get into that part of my shtick later. Because I just wanted to see to what extent your responses bring that up. It might be something I'm fixated on, but it's overly because of its consequences for build systems, for another example. I just personally feel that whenever games are thinking about one thing at the cost of others, there usually something happens that makes the game worse overall. And better is when a game finds a way to do something synergistic. The design of the game itself benefits from this or that thing, and also if we do it this way, there's this immersion benefit. Great, do that one. And there definitely are some examples of that in this parlay. So that's what it's about. I'm just going to start by reading you some of the responses, and I think whatever I had to say about it further than this will come up through context. Just Rusty. You can start us off. My most left field answer is my first 4D ride I went on at Legoland recently. Cool. Basically a cinema experience with a roller coaster and smells. The theming was that you were being pulled around on a sort of gondola underneath a magical lion. That's incredibly random, okay? I went in with less than zero expectations, but my partner loves this kind of ride, so I was willing to try it. Stunning. Absolutely magical experience. The scent of sulfur when you flew over a volcano, or the smell of plants when whizzing through the jungle, combined with the movement, just worked for me. The only other feeling that has been similar was when I first saw Avatar 1, the blue people thing, not the Last Airbender thing, when it came out in an especially large screen at the Space Center in Lister, which has been the only time 3D glasses felt like they worked, and I was totally sold on this alien environment. Super cool. What an interesting way to start things off. Sure. So, first of all, I had the Avatar 3D experience too. Yes, I don't know why I found it to be especially immersive, but that is the only time I felt like 3D was really a thing in cinema, and didn't just make the movie look like bad and also not that 3D. In general, I feel like 3D image technology in general is sort of, and this was a memorable time where I felt differently, sure. I too watched it at a noteworthy large screen. So I suppose obviously that's part of it. If the field of view is just massive, and then some of it is 3D, and that's the part of that's filling a huge amount of your field of view, and you don't like aggressively look downward or something, it feels more real. You know, that sure makes sense. I do know that Avatar Blue People movie 1's production timeline was intense. I mean, it was long as hell. They developed new 3D technology while sitting in a warehouse for years, you know, labbing out this movie. And so could it be that that is part of why that they used some novel innovations in 3D filming that would go over my head? Conceivably, sure. But we can't talk about that much more. Yeah, the 4D thing, adding smells to a cinematic experience like that. Very interesting. I will, a little bit bizarre, considering that I started this parlay by saying immersion is overrated. I am going to spend some time defending some of these immersive type elements. The 4D thing, which is often described as like people mean adding smells to a cinematic experience, is often derided by the film crowd, for example, who will say something like, the only thing that really matters is telling a good story, and this is just the way to get away from that. It's a gimmick that gets you away from these things. And indeed, I think it's an interesting thing as you go about the world. Whenever you interact with an artist, a business, any product, if you like, entertainment, whenever it has a perceived gimmick, think to yourself about how relatively good the base service is compared to other ones. So, for example, I recently went on a trip out of town and I went to a barcade, a bar that pretty much only serves alcohol drinks and non-alcoholic cocktails. Plus, this one had a lot of vintage arcade cabinets, quite a few, quite a collection, in good repair that you can play. Just to be clear, it's not like a museum. The intent is you drink while playing them. A good date spot, potentially. It has a gimmick. It's a bar. It's also an arcade. The arcade part probably isn't that compromised by being a bar, but if the main thing that you pay for is the bar, then there's the arcade. So are the drinks kind of whatever because of the gimmick? And no, they were very impressive. I mean, they were some of the best drinks I've ever had in my life. Their non-alcoholic menu is very, very impressive as well. I only ordered 2 things, so I didn't get to have that much of an experience of it. I could just sit there drinking all day. It also wasn't that pricey. It was kind of cheap. But this stood out to me because I think that that's kind of rare. What I'm implying is that usually when there's a gimmick, the base service is lackluster in exchange for the gimmick. And this makes basic sense. The economy of immersion, if you like, well, they had to pay some money to get all those arcade cabinets, keep them maintained, etc. Their business is paying some amount of money for something that isn't making the drinks good. So if they're better than other drinks, that is quite phenomenal, right? They overcame that lack of profit put into making the drinks good, but their drinks are still better than many places that don't do that. And indeed, I went to another bar while I was in this town, very nearby. You know, it's within 5 minutes walking distance, very direct competition, these 2 bars. And the second bar was very good. It was still good. It was a standout. It was a noteworthily delicious drink that I had, and it was a very nice bar with very informative, kind, helpful staff. My partner was getting out of her comfort zone a bit with drinks, and they did a great job. It was really good, but it was more expensive and had no gimmick, which makes you think, wow, what are they doing over there? That's crazy. And indeed, this barcade was hopping, always is hopping, actually. I had barely ever been, even though I knew about it, because when I've been in this area in the past, it was just so crowded. So they're certainly doing something right. But do you see my point? Obviously, on some level, something is usually going to be sacrificed. On a basic level in a video game, it's going to be they put effort into immersion elements in the game, and in some way that has shuffled around resources that probably could have somehow at least indirectly affected the game's quality in other ways which I'm arguing matter more than just making the ambiance better. If the flow of the gameplay isn't up to par, and in almost all games this could be improved, then spending a lot of time on immersive elements seems off to me. But there are times when it's done really well. You can only imagine the system that this barcade has is so good that they were able to manage the bar part and the arcade part better than other businesses could manage even one of those things. But that's kind of unrealistic in game development, right? You're not the messiah of game development. You can't just make everything better all at once most of the time. A team making, graphics or sound effects or whatever may not have its work affect the flow of the gameplay experience that much. And so you might be able to use that time to create immersion and have it not have consequences for the experience. But I think the main point here is that when immersion is a cost for an experience, it's usually because there is some resource that is in competition that could be spent elsewhere. The easy thing to think is, so it's whether using that resource for immersion is better than using it for something else. But a layer below is, there has to be something else for them to use the resources on that generates more immersion or more fun or value for the customer or whatever you want to say, than adding more immersion. And in some cases, there kind of isn't. So take the roller coaster. That's what I've been leading. This is on topic. It's a roller coaster. It's not a film. It's not a barcade. It's a roller coaster. What exactly are they supposed to do to make it more enjoyable, that rather than just making it like a more interesting track of roller coaster? Speed management and the sensation of inertia when you go through a loop or whatever, or vertigo, whatever you want to call that. Other than, I don't know, like going in a different dimension, adding sense and stuff. So it's interesting. It's still the same gimmick as in other media, but perhaps it's heightened in this context because a roller coaster is already a more sensory experience. And well, there isn't some extremely obvious other metric of immersion that they're not doing. At least I would imagine it was like a cool roller coaster, plus it had the smells, right? Because there isn't as many things they could have done to make it better other than, I don't know, find a new vector to improve on. And so sense, interesting. Whereas I think the film crew being uppity about that in cinema is that a lot of these movies are very mediocre in other ways, but are trying to like cover it up with a distracting gimmick. And like, that's not the same thing as trying to make the best experience possible, but then they will say it's to create a whole new dimension of experience, which like that's just stupid and meaningless rhetoric. And so I think it's interesting to consider how immersive elements may be good to the degree that they are the way forward rather than there being some other way forward. This is a pretty common move for me rhetorically, I'm aware. If you watch a lot of Parley, you'll be familiar with a rhetoric I'm usually pretty fond of, a tactic in discussion, where I try to universalize. Immersion is just one way to add value. Treating it as a sacred cow doesn't make any sense unless you want to make an argument that it does. And so I think that if you just look at the value proposition of adding immersion, it's going to be good or bad based on like, yeah, how much raw enjoyment it adds. We don't assume every single customer cares only about immersion and therefore it's just magically more important than some other benefit. We will get back to that later though. I just think that it's worth considering. Here maybe it's good because it is one of the only obvious vectors forward. So, an interesting little bit of the discussion to start off early on. Rather than thinking of it as only, is this the way to add resources to the experience that adds the most benefit or enjoyment? It can also be considered that sometimes immersion is a way forward to improve an experience that there are not as obvious ways to improve other ways. And maybe it's going to be better in cases like that. A pared down experience is maybe more likely to benefit from immersion than a more technical experience. Maybe, I don't know. Going into yet another twist into the discussion, something which has given me a negative experience, Just Rusty continues, which I still thoroughly enjoyed, was the game Naissance, Naissance, capital E. Naissance? Naissance, I'm going to go with. The combination of sound design, minimalist heads-up display, and the fact that your environments feel like they aren't built for you, for the player, gives you a true unsettling feeling. A dark prickle down the back of my neck, which genuinely makes me unable to play it for very long at a time. The only other thing I've felt this feeling, in a small dose, was playing the Whisper of the Worm mission in Destiny 2, which is a famously weird hidden quest, which you could only enter at certain times by traveling through content you would normally rush forward through backwards, and then just barely being able to find a way forwards through weird gaps in the machinery of an artificial world. Again, spaces which felt not built for the player, but more that someone had made this geometry and you were forced to contend with it. In a smaller dose, it was very compelling, despite not feeling pleasant. Great, another additional good framing thing. I read all these before I start, but this is a good one to start with, right? Another great point. Immersion can be this value proposition. You can evaluate how much it improves the experience compared to energy being spent on something else. Sometimes immersion is a unique, single, really only way forward. Also another angle, immersion might not be good, but still benefit the experience. That is, it might be a negative feeling, or I guess the immersion is good. But that is a positive thing in small doses. Sure. And I feel a little silly not having mentioned that. Right. It could be that you feel something jarring about working through the experience, but that is immersive in some way, that can be positive, that can add value to the experience. I don't have a ton to say about this. I just feel like there are some ground rules or guidelines that are useful. I feel like for most humans, this is going to be this interesting thing on the flow chart: challenge versus your comfort level with an activity. And if you're in the middle, this is a phenomenon we often call flow, a feeling like you can work through and cut down difficulties as they come, and you're able to exert the full force of your abilities while meeting with an appropriate level of mental resistance. It could be physical resistance. I think it's useful to think about flow when you think about negative immersion. There is a curiosity that is fighting against the frustration instead. And so you have a sort of gas tank of that, where if you give the player a small enough dose, kind of as you're just trying, like having little bits of it, they might be able to enjoy it for long enough that you can give them a complete experience, even though the immersion feels unpleasant, but is effective. But I personally think that this is going to be a mistake in longer term experiences. Or if you make an experience that is long, you might need to find ways to checkpoint it or provide short doses of it. Sure. Another game that comes to mind that people often describe in a similar way is Pathologic and its sequels. These are games where you're intentionally extremely slow to walk around everywhere, but you're timed and there's a plague going on. It depends on the game. And usually everybody basically hates you, and the combat is sort of like trying to wrestle your hand out of a jar that it's stuck into, and it's not, it maybe isn't meant to be this visceral, satisfying experience, but that's sort of the point in the game. The problem then is that I personally think Pathologic doesn't do a great job of giving you actual checkpoints or feeling like you completed a certain task. Anything in the game feels long. Like, making the player slow is a particularly risky gambit, I think. And because we've had a little while since this parlay was in the pipes, I looked at Naissance a little bit before starting this parlay. And an interesting part of what I saw of the game anyway is that the player doesn't seem to be particularly slow, if that puts a point on it any finer. That the player doesn't seem to be especially sluggish or incapable of moving around. It's the weirdness of the environment, of the HUD, of the other parts of the game. The game tries to make it so you feel capable. Again, we're kind of obeying the rules of flow, but the environment is just weird and doesn't give you an easy way forward. I think this is a different gambit than making it so the player can barely do anything in the game, and then you also don't want to have them have to do it for too long, or that it's going to overcome their patience. So it's interesting. There's a science that is a little bit separate from this parlay, but it would be interesting to talk about more, of making something unenjoyable in an enjoyable way versus unenjoyable in an unenjoyable way. And I think that a basic tip is to make it small chunks, to chunk it up. Cool. Mr. Fruit agrees. Could not agree more. Naissance is a one-of-a-kind in the realm of video games, especially as it relates to immersion. It's a more interesting answer than what I'm going to say. I think an underrated way to create immersion in a made-up world is the use of made-up language or slang. Yep, cool. A few games I immediately think of in that regard are, everybody say it together, Cyberpunk 2077, yep, okay, Underrail, and 1000X Resist. The strange thing is that they create a barrier that can prevent you from getting into the immersion, but as you learn the slang, it starts to flip and it helps you get sucked into the fictional world instead. Really good way to put it. Right. I think that the slang thing is pretty clever overall because it works well for two different types of audiences in different ways. Audience type number one. A lot of the general public of humanity simply isn't very committed to understanding and constantly skims over massive amounts of conversations they have in everyday life that they don't understand, while pretending rather convincingly that they do understand them. If you only were to lift up the rock, you would find out that they barely understood a word you said. And this works well for something like immersion, because humans are pretty good at getting things through context in the medium term. So even if people don't really try to decode the slang or whatever from the start, they feel like an other in the society, the environment, but then they pick it up over time. And so it should automatically work pretty well, much like how people pick up language without being like geniuses or anything. Immersion, physical immersion, immersing yourself around a language, is a very effective way for humans to learn things. Like, it's not perfect, but people are pretty good at that, for slang at least. Okay, then you have players who do have a commitment to understanding things in the lived environment, and these people will know that they do not understand the slang terms, but are usually thoughtful enough that they're going to notice that that is on purpose. They know they're not supposed to understand what the thing is, so they'll be patient until it works. And these people are very likely to unpack what the slang terms mean faster. And so both of those audiences, a more analytically minded and a more laissez-faire person with language, are both likely to have this work well. There is certainly a narrow span. My mom happens to be one of these people. Sorry, Mom, I'm laughing with you here. That do not feel comfortable not knowing these things. Do not feel comfortable with just waiting to see if they understand. This loses some people who get fixated on these terms. I might venture that you can unlearn this instinct, but it takes effort to do so, and you will find some sliver of the audience, how big I don't know, but I reckon not a huge amount of people, who kind of can't contend with having all these proper nouns or slang terms or nicknames for things bombarding them all at once, and can't accept that they're meant to just not know what they mean and follow the story in a different way. This is a problem that these people will tend to have with like the names of the houses in Game of Thrones, or like a fantasy book giving you a bunch of different fictional nations or whatever, that kind of thing. Hi, Mom, you know what I'm talking about here. I may have recommended a book that wasn't a great choice. Anyway, yeah, I think that it's mostly a really good technique. Its drawbacks are, I don't know what to do. I feel like if it works well for a lot of people who really dig into the text and a lot of people who don't, then that's good, and it's okay for it not to be flawless. I just thought it was interesting to note that there's that sort of compromise. So let's get some examples. Cyberpunk is probably the most prolific, with things like Choom, Corpo, Eddies, and Eddie, Nova, or Chromed, among many others, many others. Cyberpunk arguably goes a little far, but not having that many examples can be its own issue. Brandon Sanderson in the Stormlight Archive is very famous for overusing storms as like a damn or hell, or storming is used like, fucking or whatever. That fucking, chulls are a crab like beast of burden, so a chull is also like stubborn or whatever. There's an okay amount of slang stuff, but storms and storming is very overused, like way more than people would actually use this in real life, and it makes sense in the setting. It does, and having the text constantly just say storms period is like not the worst for setting the scene when your setting has repeated regular super thunderstorm, high storms, typhoons, I guess, constantly, but it does become a bit much. So I think an advantage with Cyberpunk is it does have a lot of slang and it uses it a lot. I think that by using a lot of it a lot of it feels less tired. Whereas if you were to count the frequency of using a specific slang term, it's probably higher than something like Sanderson's work, but he just is leaning on the same one maybe a little bit too often for some people, maybe me included. And so that's a whole situation. A separate topic to derail slightly is that Sanderson's work tends to be this way on other worlds as well. His shared universe, the Cosmere, has similar world building details on each world, and I believe this is a flaw ultimately, though it has some benefits. We see, just to rattle off some of his favorite, what is their swear word? What is their religious conflict? What are their prisons like? How do they imprison the people in their magic system? How do people steal or negate magic? Like, how is anywhere safe from the magic? These are not things I don't want to know or see, but because it's exactly those details in every single setting and usually not a lot of others, it becomes an issue, in my opinion. It means there's good direct comparison, but the artifice is very clear. It creates a kind of anti-immersion where I constantly notice that this is Sanderson doing that one world building thing instead of it being like, oh, people in this setting would say, rusting in Mistborn, where people get their power from eating metal or wearing metal, Allomancy and Furukami. Yeah, rust is a menace in a unique way, I guess. I don't know. If your metal that you eat for Allomancy is rusted, do you like get sick and die? I would guess yes, if it's too much of an oxide or whatever. But that's probably fine. Most of these things don't oxidize that way anyway, but they have copper. I don't know. Anyway, I don't think it's always that immersive is the point I'm trying to make. But I think a trick here is to use a lot of it. A great example with Cyberpunk. And I never really thought about it's good that they have a lot. And when you play Cyberpunk, I do also think they effectively play the verbiage, the voice actors very effectively play the verbiage as natural. It doesn't sound jarring. They say it in a natural way. I don't know if you've ever heard like younger kids swear, but they have this thing where they really lean into the swear word. They say, "What the hell are you doing?" like that, and it sounds contrived. It reads as immature. Whereas if you say it in a really calm way, "What the hell are you doing?" Like it can be menacing in a different way that it isn't if you like overly emphasize like, I just used a bad word. Ooh, look at me, fancy pants. No, it's just a normal thing. And the same thing with slang terms. I think it can be similar. So having it be played very straight and that it's not like a special thing to say is important and maybe obvious. But I appreciate that. I think that's done pretty well in Cyberpunk. And in the Cyberpunk anime Edgerunners. Underrail features common expressions like dominating, which means like rad or cool or sick. People like zoners, homeless people and drug addicts that zone out, but also used as a generic insult, possibly because of the way that Underrail's setting is laid out, ? Or the phrase to get in motion means getting high. Interesting. We are in a subway network converted into a civilization underground in Underrail. So could that be where that's coming from? Locomoting a little bit is a euphemism for getting high. Interesting. I haven't gotten far enough in Underrail to see too much of this. And I've been mostly with professionals that don't use slang as much. I also think this is another cool angle of slang. Slang can say a lot about a society's values, the use and contextual use or lack thereof of slang, and also nicknames is a really nice way to say a lot about a society. To what extent people have multiple names, nicknames that are online handles, or an alias, or multiple, or epithets, Chad the, lit or whatever, having a little attachment to your name. I couldn't think of a good one at all. It's terrible. It says a lot about a society. And so I think it's cool to see the use or lack thereof of slang. It will be interesting to see if they do that in Underrail. As I get further away from professionals in the tutorial process, do people start cussing me out in a different way more? Cool. The characters of 1000X Resist use the phrase Heki Almo as a greeting, and there are some strange naming conventions, like the security expert being referred to as Bang Bang Fire or BBF for short. Interesting. Again, the whole thing with like how do nicknames or aliases or handles work in the world. One note is that for most of these, you can kind of see where the slang could be coming from within the context of the game world. It's not that much of a stretch. The other obvious example would be Warframe, that has its own name for pretty much anything. And while I wouldn't call the effect in Warframe immersion, it feels like a contributing factor to its enduring success. Sure. Yeah, I do want to say that I think in some cases, having a different name for every little thing has its trade-offs, where sometimes I've played games where there are perks and talents and skill points, but those names are shuffled around. They're not the game's own name for those things. They're an existing, commonly used name for those things, but not necessarily the place it is commonly used. This is also somewhat subjective. It's possible that objectively most games do use skill point a certain way, but I happen to have played a subset of games that use it this way, and so it's not like they're using it in the most uncommon way. But I guess my point is that it might be better to just use your own terms there. At the same time, when it isn't a diegetic system, I think it's okay in video games to have a moment where you say, hey, we did a bunch of immersion stuff. When the player is in the build system making an obviously abstracted build-related decision, maybe we just call it a generic thing. Maybe it doesn't do a lot of good to say it's some specific thing. I really like it when games make an effort to make the name something that describes how you get it. So if it's a skill, or an innate effect, having it be that those are things you practice at and learn and gain over time versus things that you have statically at the beginning of the game. I think that helps a lot, and it's really frustrating when games do not do this, when the game uses those words but not in that way. I feel like that is bad, and it's not necessarily better if you use an immersive term. Just using a descriptive term can be okay. This is an example of the initial thrust of the parlay, that there is some compromise to just putting immersion everywhere, and there can be places where maybe you would stop, is a theme that I'm happy came up. So yeah, it's interesting to note how giving everything its own name can make things feel a little contrived. I also think there's a phenomenon where if, let's say, a game has a battle pass and you call the battle pass something other than a battle pass, but then every player who asks what the thing is just gets told, oh, it's a battle pass. Sometimes if the thing was just called something like a battle pass, you know, framed differently, Warframe has Nora's radio network for like weeklies, monthlies kind of thing, dailies. And I'm not saying it should just be called a battle pass instead of a radio thing, but having it in some places acknowledge that this is a battle pass, the game artifice that you have come to be used to, but this is our version of it, I think often draws more favorable comparisons instead of trivializing it out to, oh, it's just this thing you're familiar with. So for what it's worth, I do think these are also places where maybe having the immersive name, but then making it clear that it's pretty much this thing the player is familiar with, is good potentially. That it can be worth holding back a little with the immersion. I've definitely played games where mods refers to something that isn't used to modify a piece of equipment. Like it just kind of completes the item. You don't swap them out or whatever. Like it is basically just like, this has a flamethrower mod, but like to build a flamethrower, you just have to put that piece on. Is not, I don't know if that is actually that good. Yes, in universe, maybe it's a mod to this electronic device or whatever gas thing, blowtorch, that turns it into a flamethrower. But I think that can be a little confusing because there is a game construct idea that is mod as well, which for many people, the connotation probably isn't mandatory basic crafting components. So I don't know. I feel like that's another potential pitfall. Not a huge deal. I think the slang thing is a really good example. Yeah. And we have eye patch notes with focus on dialogue and narratives. Eye patch notes immersion comes from gameplay that references what is being said. Chaos Zero Nightmare, hello again, emphasizes the disastrous effects that chaos has on the human psyche. Chaos being an apocalyptic, galaxy-spanning force that has displaced humanity from Earth and continues to consume entire planets. A sort of cosmic horror force in the universe. The angle of the player's involvement in this story is serving the Empire's military to kill chaos. From the game's opening or promotional video, quote, "The shattering of human consciousness will no longer prevent us from delving into the chaos. Blessed with the ability to forget, without the fear of pain, injury, or death, humanity alone is up to this mission," unquote. The Empire, which you've been trademarking this whole time, sends out combatants with the expectation that they will come back broken, unless the player is specifically on top of stress management. Characters will inevitably suffer a mental breakdown during gameplay. And in this deck-building roguelike, the way that works is that when their bar of sanity damage fills up all the way, all the cards in their deck turn into like blanks that don't have their normal effect, and you have to play a certain number of them without spending mana or anything, but also while skipping that step of your turn. And you have to draw enough of their cards to get them to recover. So they, freak out and stop being valuable to your team for a little bit and clog your deck with their cards. You also lose their portion of health. Characters in Chaos Zero Nightmare are on teams of 3 and they share a health bar, but you lose the character who's having a mental breakdown's health bar contribution. So usually you lose a third of your max HP until they recover. A completed roguelike run can even result in the character needing psychotherapy after the run from the player. Players are then asked to listen to which trauma was triggered and respond appropriately, or just memory wipe them to get them back into the front lines faster. And there's some gameplay tension there. What the setting says and what the player is asked to do are in agreement, is the point. Yeah, this is something that is straightforward in a lot of games, but I do think it adds to it a little. I like a little detail in Chaos Zero Nightmare where if you keep playing with someone you don't give therapy, you can do that, but the game has basically locked you at the highest difficulty. So there's trade-offs. You might have wanted to play at the difficulty anyway. If you play Chaos Zero Nightmare, you might be thinking, yeah, it's not really a drawback. Like, I guess, but it still fits the Ludo narrative that what you're doing in the gameplay is similar to what's happening in the story. The intensity is locked high instead of it being more flexible because the person is traumatized and very wired, very high-strung to experience something intense, and so you can't make it not be the higher intensity way of playing the game. That's nice. It's something I think Chaos Zero Nightmare could and maybe will flesh out more, but I do think that this is a good thing about the game, sure. And having it be that really cool little detail is when you play at that higher intensity, one of the things that happens is characters get stressed faster, but they also get their abilities faster. They kind of grow and take mental damage faster. Every character gets their own unique condition under which they gain stress, something they're stressed out about specifically, which I thought was random at first, but it isn't as far as I know. Characters have hard-coded, hard mode conditions under which they gain more stress. So just for example, Serenial is a very overpowered attacker in this game, but her hardcore stress condition is whenever she kills an enemy, she gains a little bit of stress, which doesn't normally happen. She would be the exact unit you would have finishing enemies off. She's also particularly good at finishing enemies off. She has a lot of little piecemeal damage. One of her benefits is that she's really good at breaking her damage up, so she's really likely to be the advantageous character to finish someone off. However, you can play to this by saving whatever attacks you have from your other characters and using those to be the finishing blow on an enemy, and that can save you a little stress. There's also cases like characters will gain a big chunk of stress when you remove a card from your deck or when they copy a card. And you can plan this to be in such a way that you quickly then reduce their stress back down. You go to a rest area, you go to the shop first and remove a card, and then hit the campsite to reduce your stress right afterward, something like that. A new and pretty powerful character recently has a stress condition where she gains stress anytime your credit balance changes or you lose credits. Yikes, that's bad. It adds up, I think. It's hard to avoid it being an issue a good amount of the time, but also she doesn't gain that much per credit expenditure. So you could potentially go shopping all at once and then go to the campsite and knock out a good amount of stress. It's just an interesting way that the game does that. And I think that if the game further fleshed out, this is why. Like Serenial, in her story content, it's fleshed out pretty well that she feels guilty for, has a survivor's guilt thing going on and mostly is mercilessly willing to kill everybody and defend humanity by doing whatever else is necessary. So it's a little confused, but a little unpacked that she would feel bad anytime she finished off an enemy. Yeah, I don't know. So anyway, that is an interesting aspect of the game. They certainly try, right? For sure. It's not always the case, though, that what the setting says and what the player does are in agreement. iPatch Notes had the mild pleasure of playing Valkyria Chronicles 4 last year, a turn-based strategy game spanning one military squad's journey through bitter war. Many times, the characters say they are deep in enemy territory with limited supplies, and yet, everyone still has infinite ammo and medkits. Frontliners may eat 40 rounds of gunfire and heal it off, but become crippled in cutscenes. Some themed missions did weave story and gameplay, the majority did not, though. Indeed, I think that this is a case where many games that don't do this. I think they definitely thought of it, they just chose not to do it, probably because they didn't think of a way to make it a satisfying gameplay loop. Indeed, I think it usually takes more effort to make the gameplay of the game fit with this immersive idea, and it could be a bad idea to like do that but do it badly in the name of immersion versus just not doing it, but then you lose that immersion and it's kind of jarring. It's a complicated topic to me because to some extent you're the writer, you're God, and you can make the world be anything. And so couldn't you have just made it be that whatever the gameplay needs to be, because you can't think of a way to reflavor it to be immersively limiting or whatever? That might require certain balancing or whatever that you don't feel confident doing. Why don't you just make the story be that for some contrived reason, there just aren't limited supplies? After all, it's not going to feel dramatic to say there are limited supplies since there aren't. So why not just use your ability as the writer to find a way for there to just be infinite supplies and have the tension come from somewhere else? For example, I think in a lot of games where you have infinite medkits or whatever, a really obvious thing to do is to make the medkits have side effects. Physically, the characters can heal as much as they want, but there is some mental or social cost to doing that. Doesn't seem like rocket science. So for what it's worth, I feel like in many games, if they shy away from trying to make that immersive, maybe that was coming from a good place, not trading away gameplay awkwardness or gameplay smoothness for immersion. But I also sort of don't get the problem because I feel like you could change things around to get to the point that the gameplay and the story mesh up. You know, the story is always going to be one of the more flexible things. And a big critique I've had over the years of immersion-focused development is that you can make basically anything be the story, but you can't make anything be the satisfying gameplay. And so putting that first and then trying to make that immersive is just easier, it seems to me. Like that's just more likely to succeed. It's a more efficient way to organize those resources. But I think that when these games are pitched, it's generally the kind of context or the story of the game. And there's this idea in game design that people don't totally understand the benefit of mechanics, just in general, period. And so it might be that it was very difficult to get the game made at all without saying it would be like this. And that is now harder for them to design by committee change. I don't know about this game's development. So I think it's a weird situation when games gameplay and the story don't mix so jarringly, because you often could objectively very easily make it so that they did match. And so what prevented them from doing that? Like what entangled development timeline or process meant that they did not do that? On the other hand, it's interesting how a lot of this parlay has actually been defending immersion in some ways, or saying like it's okay if the game isn't that immersive, but it would be better if it was. There's just some trade-off where it didn't make sense. So I don't know. Very interesting. I'm pleased to have lots of negative examples. I had asked that in the prompt. I kindly hoped that you would try to find some negative examples, and I think it's nice that you put it, that you did find some, such as they are. Because they're interesting. As Just Rusty mentions, to some extent it can be positive when immersion is uncomfortable, but then there's also cases where, yeah, it isn't really very immersive. The immersion part isn't really working. That's negative, but maybe that was a positive development decision in the grand scheme of things. It's just interesting. I don't know. And maybe it wasn't. Maybe there's really no good reason. Another spectrum of immersion is presentation, iPatchNotes continues. Library of Ruina puts the attacker of a given conflict on the left of the screen and the defender on the right. In universe, the library is enticing people to come in and fight for rewards. If the invaders on the left side win, they can take a book from the library. If the library on the right side wins, the invaders get turned into books. This becomes the library's power progression in both story and gameplay. Each victory results in books, booster packs, that are handed out to new characters and skills. The player gets new resources to use. This also makes the library more of a feared name within the city, stronger and stronger individuals coming to suppress the growing threat or reclaim their loved ones. However, the library has its own demons, abnormalities, residing within. The player is regularly invited to upgrade existing floors or open new ones through internal combat. Now the librarians are placed on the left, the abnormalities on the right. Subtly changing who gets placed on the defending side gives the setting more weight to the parlay offer. And somehow I got Librarians are on the left, abnormalities on the right. Got it. Yes. Okay. One last example comes from Flavor. ChronoArc's Sizz is the resident puppeteer that rewards sequencing abilities just so. In-game, this is represented by Eve, a doll, who will follow one of the player's 4 characters at a time. Targeting an ally recharges Eve and places them on the ally's part of the UI. Targeting the enemy potentially causes Eve to do a follow-up attack. Eve will only perform a follow-up attack if already on the shoulder of a character who's attacking. Combined with Sizz being a healer, the player can really feel like a puppet master. Send Eve to pick up a character from Death's Door, then mount a comeback offensive. Battles playing out in pseudo-first person also reinforces that they are from Lucy's perspective, the protagonist or your 5th deck-building character. Right. I really like that about Sizz. There's a feeling like because she's a healer, you want to put a Eve on top of one of your allies, and then she's on their shoulder to attack with them when, you get her offensive benefits. And also the idea that you kind of prime Eve by putting her on an ally, and then you might use another ability to get her to attack or do a certain ability. It really feels like you have to move her to them first, and then when she's there, then you can do this other thing. That process is 2 steps is kind of nice, kind of satisfying. There's something there. We talked about on the stream just the other day how card games can be very non-kinesthetic. When you play a card in a game, it often doesn't really feel like you're doing a sword slash or whatever. Ragnavar, you gave this example, a good example during that stream. And this is a way that they get some of that back. Yes, the card is still just playing a card that abstractly represents Eve going to your ally, but at least you have to do 2 separate actions. And in a card game where your enemy's action count ticks down as you do stuff, it feels slow, or like you have to do some setup, get Eve in position. Puppeteering maybe is not the fastest way to fight in a game like this, but you get a lot of benefit for the setup. And the character's of a modest power level as well, which doesn't hurt. So having a bit of a faff to get them in position, maybe it works kind of well here. I personally feel like it did. So yeah, I think this was pretty effective. This was a shorter crew parlay, but I feel like we pretty effectively covered most of the topic, most of what I was keen on about the topic too. I thought this was a pretty effective one. Overall, that immersion can be very valuable and come from a lot of places, and a lot of those places can come from game design and also can come from simply using verbiage. They don't necessarily have to come from massively transforming the game. I think it's cool that a lot of what we saw here is basically not that complicated. Something like adding a sulfur smell to a volcano-looking part of a roller coaster using a critical mass of slang terms and having them feel not overacted or over, described, and simply making the amount of steps in game it would take to do a certain action physically be the number of steps you have to, have that match up. You need to bring the puppet over and then do an ability with it. And so that's 2 cards. So it feels like you have to do 2 steps, something like that. Putting the characters on the attacking or defending side in a given environment. Sure. A really interesting way for games to feel like you're more immersed or the things are appropriate or as they would be. It was thought about what it would be like to do this in this world without really paying huge amounts of development cost. Actually, that was the thing that was kind of surprising to me about this parlay. Upon further analysis, at least the discussion we've done here, there's not a lot of cases where there is that much of a trade-off exactly in many cases. It's more like, are these elements considered carefully and does the game take the time to address them, or does it maybe sometimes privilege other things? Again, we have games privileging discomfort. It's still immersive, but it's kind of an uncomfortable immersion, or games where maybe they steered away from immersion, but perhaps that was a good decision. It's, we never really will know. So it's interesting to see that there are so many cases where it's kind of fine. I also think that, to go back to Chaos Zero Nightmare for a minute, it is an example for me of a game where they thought of times where the game can be more immersive that felt pretty natural, where I don't think it will have been that difficult for them to think, hey, some games have sanity damage already, or mental damage, going back to tabletop role-playing games like Call of Cthulhu or whatever, and it's been in some video games, Darkest Dungeon comes to mind. Why don't we take that a little further and have it be that there's something you have to unpack if you win, but everybody has had a mental breakdown by the time you get to the end? Give the player some cleanup that they can do or not do for a potential consequence if they decide to go that route. Another thing I forgot to mention is that if you leave your player in their traumatic state, you can't use the save data, the results of your roguelike run, which in Chaos Zero Nightmare you can use as part of your build for the rest of the game. There's only some of it is the roguelike, and when you play that, you get a save data snapshot of what you got in the roguelike that can then be used as a build in the rest of the game, but not if they're traumatized. You have to get through that first. And there's some element by which maybe this is not true anymore. Like you could potentially lose parts of that build if you therapied them badly. I don't know if that's still a mechanic actually, because that recently changed. But a cool thing. Maybe that's going a little far since you can't really prevent them from going crazy. So go figure. We have to finish you off as a little treat, a snippet of slang dialogue from Underrail. Mr. Foot, you clipped this out for us. One ladle man saying, hey, Lily ain't no disease-ridden zone grinder. She's got standards. She's got the looks and the charm. And that's where my sweet little sis lives a better pipe-working life than me. Got this nice place in Core City, food, water, fine clothes, coins, while I'm here sweating my ass off with all you people. And I love that it then says, only a single option, continue. Player, I'm going to hit you with the horrifying realization that you have no choice but to continue speaking with this man. And that's what immersion is all about. Trapping you in the room, sweating your ass off with those people. Glorious. Yeah, we didn't get into a really obvious additional way to take this discussion, but which really didn't come up at all, so I don't think we'll do it here, is to help create immersion in like tabletop role-playing game environments. I think this often requires a different approach in many cases, but is also a place where all these things can potentially apply. I think the gimmicky approach is really common in those settings, but I personally also like really technical approaches, like making a setting feel like certain kinds of people or species, races, walks of life are more common by giving them more slots on a random table, which you roll on when you decide most NPCs species. This organically makes it feel like there are just more of a certain kind of person, and then what kind of person is judged or not. I think it's interesting to have tieflings, which explicitly come from the Hells, which are explicitly a real place in D&D, to be maligned most places, but then also not maligned some places. And so that's kind of a noticeable thing about your character, whereas maybe humans will be mocked for being short-lived. Elves might be considered valuable to have in a party if you have one, because they don't have to sleep in the same way. Same thing for a Warforged, and making it so there are these like subtler little benefits that are a benefit of the, I mean, it's a listed feature when you play a human or an elf or whatever. To an extent, tieflings don't list that people don't like them, but you know, it is basically a feature of these species. So I think it's cool to lean into that a little. And it often has minimal actual consequences for the player. So I think it's not, you know, consequential as a balancing. I mean, tieflings are overpowered anyway, right? So that's also, it's probably fine if people like your charisma checks are slightly harder. If you're probably going to stack charisma anyway, and tieflings are already pretty strong. So we could have gotten into that, maybe, obviously. But I feel like it's pretty separate from the direction this parlay went in. So let's leave that for another time. But yeah, I think this was a great little way to dip our toes in. We could probably do more on immersion, don't you reckon? Now, normally at the end of Crew Parlay, I tell you what the next prompt is so that you can respond to it if you want to. Normally I do one of these every month. We're backed up right now, so I will tell you what the next one is out of habit, but I will let you know within the next few when we're caught back up. I'm hoping for it to be within a month. So the next one is for what was going to be for February. Moments that haunt you in games. This was a prompt from Mr. Food. It says, is there a moment from a game that haunts you? One you cannot stop thinking about even weeks and months after experiencing it? If so, what are those moments? I have some that come to mind, but I want to hear other people's moments. I added, any thoughts about why this or that moment really stuck with you? Or perhaps you feel it's a moment that more universally sticks with lots of players. Why might that be? and we have some responses that I hope you look forward to. Looking forward to the next one of these. Folks, this is at the $5 tier on my Patreon, so a lot of people have this. If you're a Twitch sub and you have your Discord account connected, I give this for that tier as well. I treat those as the same. It doesn't have to be through Patreon, in other words, if you don't want to. So a lot of you listening to this have it. You can respond to these Crew Parley every month through the Discord. Let me know if you need help with that. I'm happy to get you set up. Anyway, look forward to the next one. I know I am.